Good morning from London. I'm Kriti Gupta alongside Tom McKenzie and Lizzie Burden. We're an hour away from the opening trade. Here's what you need to know. President Joe Biden bows out of the 2024 race, backing VP Kamala Harris in a rare move that leaves the Democratic Party scrambling ahead of its virtual roll call and convention. Meanwhile, markets pricing in the Trump trade as policy changes on both sides of the aisle remain fairly hazy. We're going to bring you the latest. Plus, flight cancellations roll on for a third day after Friday's global tech outage. We're live at Farnborough Air Show with the leaders of the aviation and defense industry to discuss the fallout.
OK, let's check in on the markets right now then as investors realign for the political uncertainty that is unfolding and emanating from the United States. European futures pointing higher right now by 0.4%. Here in the UK, FTSE 100 futures looking to add 37 points. The US 2-year at 450. We want to be looking at the 10-year as well. We'll bring that to you shortly. Euro dollar at 108. Currently flat. A little bit of softness coming through for the Bloomberg dollar index. Gold is bid at record levels on the back of some of this political uncertainty as markets try to readjust, and we unpack, of course, the Trump trade for you and the implications. There's the 10-year, 421 on the benchmark. Money moving in, down 2 basis points in terms of yield. We, of course, continue to unpack the story out of China as well. A surprise rate cut coming through from the PBOC, but the focus, of course, remains on the US politics. The countdown to the opening trade starts right now.
A momentous day, a momentous 24 hours in American politics, one that has ripple effects around the world as President Biden bows out of the 2024 presidential race, throwing his hat, throwing his weight behind Kamala Harris, the VP. Tom, Lizzie, this is such an important moment. It is unprecedented in the modern era. You have to go all the way back to 1968 for a one-term president to not throw their hat in the ring. And now Democrats scrambling to see who can take on President Trump in November.
Lyndon B. Johnson, 1968, and of course, the vice president taking over and losing ultimately in that election, which doesn't bode well. But of course, the historical parallels don't always mirror in the current day. But it is a momentous moment. In some respects, not a surprise, of course, but still a shock.
No, you'd had 30 Democrats piling in to call for him to step aside, and you'd also had, of course, the Trump assassination attempt. It had become a question, really, of when, not if, it seemed. He'd seemed to be staring down the barrel of an inevitable defeat here. But it is unprecedented. If you go back to LBJ, really, what a moment yesterday. We have to now ask, is it too little too late?
Yeah, it's an enormous moment. And again, we still have several ways to go. She does have the endorsement of President Biden, of the Clintons, of course, not yet President Obama, even though he's been very vocal behind the scenes to make sure President Biden does indeed step down. Does she get the delegates? Does she get the campaign money? There's still a lot to digest here. Let's go straight to Washington, D.C. Vonnie Quinn has been monitoring this overnight for us, minute by minute. Vonnie, bring us the latest out of D.C.
You mentioned the campaign money, and the answer to that is yes, because if President Obama doesn't endorse her, that's one thing. But if President Biden is endorsing her, that's quite another thing. And that money was raised on the Biden-Harris ticket. So she just gets to take that now if she does indeed become the nominee. Not only that, but if you look at what donations we saw in a single day yesterday on the Act Blue platform, which is small dollar donors, it far exceeds, it triples any other previous day in terms of a record. We're not even 12 hours since President Biden sent that post on X saying that he was, in fact, pulling out. This on the 4th day of his confinement due to COVID-19. And as Lizzie said, after several torturous weeks for the president, who will, by the way, continue to serve out his term. Now, this means that Kamala Harris is the presumptive nominee, at least for now. The Democratic Convention Rules Committee is convening on Wednesday. They want to make this process transparent. They want it to be in the open. They don't want there to be any legal challenges that they cannot meet. And so far, everybody seems to be playing ball, because as the afternoon wore on, and bear in mind the tweet went out just before 2 p.m. local time, as the afternoon wore on, those endorsements from high-powered Democrats did come in, and they started to come in more and more throughout the afternoon. I'm talking about Elizabeth Warren. I'm talking about Jim Clyburn, for example. Gretchen Whitmer didn't formally endorse, but did suggest that she was very much backing Kamala Harris. And then, of course, we had the delegations Republicans. So state by state, we haven't had all of them come in yet, but state by state, we started to see states saying that they were going to endorse Kamala Harris. It seems to be a hugely uniting moment for the Democratic Party, and the message certainly seems to have gone around to the individual states and to all of the leading voices in the Democratic Party. Show unity, because guess what? The RNC helped the Republicans unify on their front, and that's what we have to beat.
A really interesting point. Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn out of Washington, D.C. We thank you for that update. Guys, I think, in terms of the questions going ahead and what comes next, Vonnie raises them. It's what's next in terms of replacing Biden? You've got markets pricing an 80% chance of it being Kamala Harris. Who's the VP? And as Vonnie says, what happens in terms of those donations, past and future? You've already had this $50 million surge in donations since Biden has stepped aside. Just on that first point, though, does it, by going through the actual process, going through the motions, energise the campaign? Does it vitalise, legitimise Kamala Harris?
Yeah.
Or does it actually open the door to a bit of a squabble at the Democratic convention?
I mean, dissent is the big threat here, and this is why she's talking about unity, Vonnie is, and you are as well, when we're talking about getting people to back Kamala Harris. That is not a sure thing yet, and we're not even waiting till the Democratic convention August 19th. We're waiting till the virtual roll call, which, again, reports are the first week of August is when that's going to happen. They're trying to compete against an Ohio ballot deadline, some internal politics there, racing against the GOP. She not only has to pick her VP, she has to gain the support. The clock is ticking in a very, very big way. And that's where the focus comes to the swing states of North Carolina, Georgia, for potential VP picks.
Yeah, absolutely. And that will be consequential in terms of someone who can square up to J.D. Vance when it comes to some of those swing states. And as you were saying, Lizzie, look, there's a cost, isn't there, to being crowned as the nominee versus an open contest. And the open contest potentially opening things up to splits and divisions versus being crowned, where you get the unity. But, of course, there is possibly an impact in terms of the symbolism and the imagery of that. In terms of the Trump trade, such a big focus for us all last week on this ascendant Republican Party. And talking of unity, my goodness, was it there for the Republicans last week? Part of the Trump trade, you can look at crypto for that, expectations that maybe Trump and J.D. Vance are going to be more open in terms of the cryptocurrency industry and less hardline in terms of regulation. Then there's the story around some of the small caps in the US on expectations that tax cuts will help them, that in fact trade barriers will help them as well. And we've seen a narrowing of the yield curve. But then there's the inflation risk, and we've seen this bearish tilt higher in terms of yield curve at the long end, particularly yields higher at the long end, a little bit of softness at the front end. So that yield curve tightening, or I should say tightening in terms of the corporate story and less inversion when it comes to the sovereign story and their focus on the 10-year. In terms of how we adjust to that on expectations that Kamala Harris becomes the nominee for the Democrats is going to be interesting. The uncertainty, though, clearly front and centre of these markets.
It is, and already, I mean, just this morning, you're already seeing weakness in, say, the Chinese yuan, for example. You've got that tariff read-through. You've got gold at a record high. You were pointing this out in your show as well. You also have, I thought, some interesting bids into haven assets. You've seen strength in the Japanese yen, strength in the Swiss franc. The rotation we've been talking about, you mentioned the small caps, also very friendly towards energy, towards oil companies, towards really a lot of those kind of more red sectors as well. So that's going to be a really crucial conversation, especially when we talk about the broader international sphere as well. We still have that security conversation to have as well. And I think that's really important when we kind of get the global and the international interaction. I want to actually maybe bring in another voice here. And that, of course, is going to be Oliver Crook, because he's been monitoring this from the international standpoint. Again, we are hearing plenty of support, but we're also seeing some pushback. We have Viktor Orban just coming out in the States. I'd like to get that fresh perspective out of Berlin. Again, Oliver Crook joining us this morning. Ollie, your take from where you are.
Of a sort of half-century political career of Joe Biden, and one where he's been very enmeshed with a lot of foreign policy, even as a senator and certainly as a president. And you get that feeling when you hear from the sort of European leaders out this morning. So we hear from Olaf Scholz, for example, out on Twitter thanking him, saying that the transatlantic cooperation as a result of Joe Biden is close. NATO is strong, and the United States is a good and reliable partner for us. His decision not to run again deserves respect. And this is really the message that we're getting across Europe this morning. We've heard heard, also from Japan saying that the U.S.-Japanese relationship is stronger than ever. And when you think about it really in terms of Germany and the United States in the context of that relationship, particularly after what came before, which was Trump, where you had a very sort of strong critic of Germany and Europe on the questions of NATO, on Russian gas. Now, you may say that this has been sort of gratified as being sort of accurate criticism in retrospect, but it was really the manner in which it was conducted. And so for many of the leaders today looking forward, they're not necessarily looking at Kamala Harris as a candidate in her policies, what she holds, but they're really thinking about the calculus of how she is going against Donald Trump, because that is really going to be the main wild card here for the leaders, whether it is, Zelensky over in Ukraine, or Netanyahu over in Israel, who, by the way, is on his way to D.C. right now and is, this all happened while he was on the plane.
Ollie, talk to us about the international reaction that we've seen so far. And leaders in Germany have come out and commented on this. How much unity is there in terms of the response to this decision by Biden?
Listen, I think that everyone respects it. Everyone, I think, saw it coming to a certain degree. I think that, the writing was really on the wall at the latter end of the week. And I think now what they're trying to appraise is, what is Kamala Harris and what is her position? Where could things really realistically shift? I think the truth of the matter is it won't really change that much on international policy. Most of her strengths have been on domestic issues. That's really what she's been playing towards. The sort of main international point is with one border in specific, and that's a southern border with Mexico, where, so she's been consistent on Ukraine. She's been consistent on Russia and China and all those sorts of things. And she has filled in for Biden on a number of events. I mean, she's been to the Munich Security Conference a number of times, notably just days before the Russian invasion, and sort of was warning about that. But where you will see a little bit of difference, and this is interesting, given that Netanyahu is on his way to Washington, D.C., is on the question of Israel. She was one of the sort of first critics in a very high position in the U.S. government to talk about how Israel was prosecuting the war, but also talking about, wanting to get a ceasefire in early. So I think that is a place where you could see a little bit of shift. Of course, foreign policy is probably a weaker point when she goes up against Trump, who obviously already was president and has dealt with a number of these nations before.
OK, so respect for Joe Biden from international leaders. We'll have to see how seriously they take his foreign policy ambitions now that he's a lame duck, effectively. But Oliver Crook, we thank you for that analysis from Berlin. Here's what else you need to know this morning in terms of your top stories. Bloomberg has learned that Nippon Steel has hired former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to help complete a proposed purchase of United States Steel, a deal facing bipartisan opposition from Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. Pompeo, who served as the top American diplomat under Trump, will advise the Japanese company as it looks to clear the $14 billion takeover. Elsewhere, Chinese banks have cut their main benchmark lending rate for the first time since August 2023. That's on the heels of the PBOC's surprise move to trim a key short-term policy rate for the first time in almost a year. The cuts come as economic growth slowed in the second quarter to the worst pace in more than a year as consumer spending falls. And Ryanair has cut its outlook for ticket prices in the crucial summer period, saying that fares will be materially lower in the quarter as consumers grow more cautious. The Irish budget carrier saw average fares fall 15% in its most recent quarter, with profits after tax declining by almost half.
Yeah, spoke to the CFO on Bloomberg Daybreak, Neil Sorahan, who said this is good news for flyers, maybe not so good for their profits. Ryanair falling, by the way, 4.5% on TradeGate. The stock is down about 14% year to date.
It's certainly going to be an interesting conversation to have later at Farnborough as we talk about that in the context, by the way, of not just the demand story, but of course the global IT outage as well. In addition, by the way, coming up, we're going to be staying across the big story of the day. After President Biden drops out of the running for the White House, we've got you covered with an all-star class, including Thomas Gift from UCL, geopolitical strategist Tina Fordham, and of course, up next, it's Joanna Maska, CEO of the Global Situation Room and formerly a member of the Obama administration. If you have any questions of your own for our guests, please send them to us on IB plus BBTV Go. More ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Donald Trump were to win in November, he will continue to sell out working families. Donald Trump has openly vowed, if reelected, that he'll be a dictator on day one. Joe Biden and I trust women, and women trust all of us to fight for their
most fundamental freedoms.
U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris there, who just launched her bid from the Democratic presidential nomination on Sunday, of course, getting the backing of her President Joe Biden. We should mention those comments were, of course, before her announcement on Sunday as well. But what comes next? We have the perfect voice to talk about is Joanna Maska, CEO of Global Situation Room, who has previously served as White House Director of Press Advance for the former President Obama, joins us this morning out of Paris. Joanna, a pleasure to have you on the program. Look, this has been a wild 24, 48 hours inside and out, but it feels like the messaging here has been one of chaos within the Biden campaign, chaos within the Kamala Harris campaign. How does the Democratic Party show, one, that they're united behind Kamala Harris, and two, that this is not a last-minute decision and one that actually is thought out?
Well, Kriti, it isn't a last-minute decision. I know I had said, after I saw him at the NATO press conference, now 2 Thursdays ago, I believed he would drop out. He was indicating that he knew, while he believed he was the best to govern, he didn't know that he was the best to win, and he was looking for the advice and counsel of people who could tell him what to do. There were even some rumors that he may drop out on Sunday. Those rumors obviously became true with that tweet yesterday, which, of course, took a lot of people by surprise because the campaign had been fiercely defending his ability to stay in this race. What we're seeing now is that they're trying to put together the process as quickly as they can with the DNC to have a process for Kamala Harris and potentially others to compete. And while it may look messy right now, we still have more than 100 days of this campaign. We will have a solid nominee, one who can appeal broadly, whereas Donald Trump has just spent the last week showing us that he is very conservative, populist. It's kind of all over the map on where he is on foreign policy. We'll have a great Democratic nominee to stand up against Donald Trump and hopefully, keep America moving in the right direction.
Well, Joanna, talk to us then about what comes next here. We, of course, know that the clock is ticking when it comes to that virtual roll call. Reports saying it's going to be the first week of August. All eyes internationally seem to be on who that VP pick is going to be. You read the strategist notes, and it looks like the focus is going to be more on North Carolina, Georgia, potentially Roy Cooper in that VP seat. What's the right move here for the Kamala Harris campaign?
Well, I see two fantastic contenders if she is the nominee. And I'm not going to rush to any judgment. There could be other people who would throw their hats in. Joe Manchin supposedly was flirting with it. I'm not interested in Joe Manchin. Wes Moore, if he did, I would be interested. But if it is Kamala Harris, there are two VP candidates who I think would be very solid for her, both Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona and Pennsylvania's Governor Josh Shapiro. And the reason why is twofold. Both of them, actually, Mark Kelly has a military background. Obviously, he was an astronaut. He's married to Gabby Giffords, who was a victim of an assassination attempt herself. He's been a very strong senator. He won very overwhelmingly in Arizona, which is a key state. Josh Shapiro is the Pennsylvania governor. Pennsylvania is a critical state for Democrats, but also Shapiro presents a fantastic, inclusive message for what the future of our economy can be for places like Pennsylvania that competes directly with what J.D. Vance, of course, the vice presidential candidate for Donald Trump, is going for. Those kinds of workers who feel like they've been left behind, that J.D. Vance is saying, well, we're just going to have, churches solve all the problems. And Josh Shapiro is going to say, that's not actually going to solve our problems, and here's what would.
So, Johanna, and of course, with the context and the caveat that we don't know yet if Harris will be the official nominee, it's certainly looking like that. It's certainly pointing in that direction. In terms of the domestic policy agenda then, and you talk about the economic priorities of this Democratic Party, would you expect Harris, if she gets that nomination, to lead a continuation of Bidenomics, of Biden's economic policies, or do you see adjustments and changes?
Well, look, everybody does have adjustments and changes. No leader is exactly the same as the others, but she actually is someone who's cared a lot about American jobs, California, if taken out of the United States, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world. So we have a robust economy in our state. She's been, come up through California politics, but she's not some crazy California progressive. She's always presented a more moderate front. And so I expect you would see that continuation with kind of a new take on things. I mean, she's a tech-friendly generation, but, holds them accountable. In her job as Attorney General, she worked to hold people accountable. So I think you're going to see that balance in a very different way than you would see from Donald Trump. I mean, his policies are very thin. He says he wants the largest mass deportation of undocumented immigrants in the United States in our history. That's all fine and good on paper, but when Americans actually see their children's friends, parents ripped out of our communities, it would look a lot different. So I think she's going to make that stark contrast. We can be both inclusive and have tough policies so that people do have to come to the United States legally, that they do need to be, a law and order citizens, unlike Donald Trump.
Johanna, one clear dividing line between Biden and Harris is foreign policy. And of course, Biden has deep and decades-long experience when it comes to foreign affairs, and he knows many of the key players personally and has known them over decades. This is clearly an area where Kamala Harris is facing a huge catch-up. To what extent is that a vulnerability, do you think?
Well, I would say it's not as big of a gap as you say. Of course, Biden has 50 years on about everybody. Trump had no foreign policy experience. I mean, he'd had Miss America overseas and Trump hotels. So when it comes to Kamala Harris, she actually did deal with issues like California's a border state when she was Attorney General. So I would counter the narrative that she has thin experience in that area. And I would say that actually one of the things that Americans have not seen, she has spent a lot of her time traveling abroad. And those have not been super public engagements. They've been rather under the radar, designed so that she would be able to do the work for the president and not necessarily have big press conferences or big events abroad. So I would counter that narrative, and I would say undoubtedly she'll have a fantastic foreign policy team.
And Johanna, I hate to have to ask you this, but you played a critical role in Obama's first campaign. You've seen how Donald Trump talked about Barack Obama. You've seen how he talked about Hillary Clinton. How much racism and sexism should Kamala Harris, if she's picked, brace for in this campaign? And how much will her race and gender matter to the American voting public of 2024?
I will never underestimate the American people's ability to see candidates for the people who they are. Because I remember when I started working for Barack Hussein Obama, and everyone said, there's no way you can get that guy elected. And we did. Donald Trump can be vicious with his attacks. The white nationalism that he has surrounded himself with is extraordinarily dangerous for our country and for the world. I am quite confident that he will attack her in different ways. But I would say as long as she has the message, one of inclusivity and a future of America, she will resonate across race, across class, across gender. And that is what she needs to focus on, is relating with American people and explaining how her story is very similar to those other American people.
OK, Johanna Maska, CEO of Global Situation Room. Wonderful to have you on the programme as we look ahead to that campaign, if indeed it is Kamala Harris. Coming up on the programme, as senior Democrats rally behind her, we'll discuss what it means for the race for the White House. This is Bloomberg.
30 minutes from the start of the opening trades across Europe. There's a lot to digest. There's that political uncertainty. We're still dealing with the fallout of the IT outage over on Friday. Cancellations going globally. We're also dealing with some of the market pricing here. Do we start to see elements of a Trump trade? Well, I'd argue we're already seeing that in just this morning. Some green on the screen when you look at the equity market. Euro Stoxx 50 futures higher by 0.7%. A similar story for the FTSE 100. But the currency market gets interesting because you are seeing strength in the Japanese yen, strength in the Swiss franc, some bid for havens, gold at a record, and weakness in the Chinese yuan, weakness in the Mexican peso. The countries that seem to be perhaps a victim of the Trump foreign policy agenda trading slightly weaker in their currencies this morning. How much of that is a reaction, an early reaction to the political story? That's my question, Tom.
Yeah, some of those haven trades on the back of this political uncertainty. And my goodness, how much volatility we've seen just in the last few weeks when it comes to US politics. Let's try and get a gauge as to how this unfolds from here then and bring in Thomas Gift, Director of the Centre on US Politics at University College London, joining us out of Massachusetts this morning. Thomas, thanks for your time. Bottom line, does this change the prospects for the Democrats when it comes to November?
Well, that's the big question. I think that Biden dropping out makes the election, again, a referendum on Trump and not Biden's age. And all things considered, I think that's good for Democrats. If Harris is the nominee, she'll have a chance to keep the spotlight on Trump's challenges to democratic institutions and norms. She'll have a chance to keep the focus on Trump's first term and his demagoguery. She'll have the chance to remind voters of all the fallout of Trump's 2 impeachments and January 6th and all of the scandals and mini scandals in between. The one thing that I will say, though, is I'm not sure if Americans' opinions of Kamala Harris are fully formed yet. She's sort of been relegated to a set of low priority portfolio of issues. That's changed a little bit with her work on abortion after the Dobbs decision. But, you know, I think that she has a chance to make sort of a second first impression, so to speak, especially as we head into the convention.
Well, do we need an open convention for that, or is being crowned an important move for this Democratic Party that wants that unity? Where do you stand on that issue, Thomas?
Well, I think with Biden endorsing Harris, Harris is the presumptive nominee. Party elites will say that there will be an orderly, transparent process to find a successor, but I suspect that the convention will be a coronation. I think even if Biden hadn't endorsed her, it would have been hard for another candidate to challenge Harris. Not only is she Biden's vice president, but she's also the first woman of color to hold that position. We've already seen some other names like Pennsylvania's Josh Shapiro and California's Gavin Newsom endorse Harris. One interesting wrinkle is that former Senator Joe Manchin has said that he might consider coming into the race. I know that there's been talk about kind of a mini primary between now and the convention, but I really don't think that happens. I do think that one concern with the perception that this is a coronation is that Harris's support looks like it's coming from the top down by Democratic elites, whereas Trump's support looks like it's coming from the bottom up by the Republican base.
OK, that's interesting. Well, flipping over to the Republican camp, do you think that Trump will now be regretting perhaps choosing J.D. Vance as his running mate now that he's no longer running against Joe Biden?
Well, he'll never admit that, but I think probably. And I think that Trump maybe could have balanced out a ticket with a woman, just in terms of identity politics that may appeal to suburban women, for example. But Trump really had to make the decision with the information that he had. I mean, there's a lot of speculation about whether whether Biden was going to get out. I think Trump, the entire time, his campaign has sort of been waiting for this, so I think they're a little bit more prepared. I'm sure that was part of the calculus. But yeah, I think if not regrets, there probably would have been some more thought given to some alternatives.
And for the Democrats, then, who would be a smart pick for VP alongside Kamala Harris if she is running against Trump?
Well, I guess my pick would be Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, so I'm probably a bit partial to that. But I do think, just for the sheer fact that Pennsylvania holds 20 electoral votes in the Electoral College, that could make a big difference. If Pennsylvania is in play, I think that makes it more likely that Ohio is in play. So just from that standpoint, I think he would be a smart choice. He's perceived as a moderate. He's kind of a rising star within the Democratic Party. Of course, one concern is that he hasn't really been vetted on a national scale, and so that's always an issue to be worried about, but I think he would be a great choice and a really nice counterbalance to Harris.
Well, Thomas, personal bias aside on the Pennsylvania, because to be fair, President Trump has a pretty decent following in Pennsylvania. In fact, if you look at the polling, the gap in polling is the largest versus any other swing state. Would a Josh Shapiro, as a VP, narrow that gap, even close it altogether? Is that enough to undermine his advantage there?
I'm not sure if it would be enough to undermine Trump's advantage. You rightly point out that it is sizable. It's not even within the margin of error right now. But we have seen historically in the past that vice presidents can make a difference on the margins, particularly in states from which they hail. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro is really popular in the state. I can just say from firsthand experience and just looking at some of the polls, approval ratings upwards of 60%. So I think that at the very least, the fact that Pennsylvania could be in play, it would cause Trump to need to devote resources to Pennsylvania, even if he can still win it. And that would divert resources away from other swing states where he needs to win.
Well, I want to bring it right back to President Trump and follow up on Lizzie's question here. He's been making a concerted effort, it feels like, even within his own party, despite picking J.D. Vance as his number 2, to kind of push back against the more MAGA, the more Project 2025 agenda, despite some of his former members of his administration helping create the very policy from the Heritage Foundation. How successful is that move? Is he able to broaden out to the Nikki Haley's, the Mike Pence's, the more conservative Republicans of his party? I'm going to throw Mitt Romney in there as well.
Yeah, no, I think Trump is so confident in his ability to resonate with his base. He doesn't even feel a need anymore to kowtow to pure MAGA voters. And I think you rightly point out with Project 2025, he says, I haven't really heard about it. I don't know what it is. It's a bunch of extreme policies. That's really notable. I do think that there are some elements of MAGA that have sort of radicalized beyond even where Trump is. And going into a general election, Trump kind of wants to position himself more as a centrist. I mean, he certainly doubles down on the base, and that's his priority. But I don't think that he wants to be tagged, especially with some of the proposals in Project 2025 related to abortion, because he realizes that that's an Achilles heel. I think that Trump is pretty pragmatic. And the one thing about Trump this time around is that he seems to be, at least by his standards, running kind of a more disciplined campaign. And I think that this is one example of that.
Well, I wonder how much comfort international observers should take from that, Thomas. As I'm sitting here in London, of course, where you're normally based, and particularly thinking about the conflict in Ukraine and the response from European leaders, and, of course, the question marks about NATO. How should all of those factors be viewed in light of a potential Harris-Trump runoff in November?
Well, I do think that European leaders and world leaders more generally need to be concerned about a second Trump presidency. There's really no doubt about that. I mean, Trump made clear where he stands on Ukraine. He said he would end the war on day one, although never actually gave any sort of sense of how he would do that. But just generally, America First foreign policy is kind of a belligerent, isolationist foreign policy. Trump attacked world leaders. He pilloried the international organizations like NATO. He said that he would allow Putin to essentially do whatever the heck he wanted in Eastern Europe. I think you have to take Trump at his word, because during his first term, he was really skeptical of international collaboration. And I think it's fair to say that he has cozied up to some dictators. So if you're a world leader in Europe, I think you're certainly hoping that Kamala Harris is able to pull this out.
In terms of foreign policy, before we get to that next president, how much influence can Joe Biden actually have in his final days? We've got Netanyahu, of course, visiting Washington this week.
I think Biden is a total lame duck at this point. I think he has no political leverage whatsoever. It's maybe one reason why he waited so long to bow out if he was considering it, in addition to the fact that I think it shortens this time period in between when he exits the race and the convention, which limits the infighting. But I don't think domestically or foreign policy-wise, Biden really has any clout in it anymore. He's really just setting up this transition for Harris.
Thomas, at the end of the day, we can debate policy all we want, but we are speaking to a financial network here. And I think everyone wants to know, at least in the financial community, do either of these options save American finances? We have a deficit problem. We have a debt ceiling deadline coming up in January of 2025. First thing on the new president's agenda, whoever that may be. Do either of these candidates offer a solution that might put some of our financial watchers at ease?
Well, I don't think either of these candidates can be reasonably called a deficit hawk. And I think that we can expect more spending, more deficit spending under both administrations. Trump has really been championing additional tax cuts, which of course he got through during his first term. I think we could probably expect more of that. I think that President Harris would even be more aggressive on social spending and entitlements. We're not going to get any type of reform, for example, on some of these big budgetary items like Social Security. So, as much talk as there is about polarization in Washington, the one thing that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree about is that the federal government is going to spend more than it takes in revenue. That hasn't changed, and it will not change.
A very similar message to what we hear right here in Europe. Thomas Gift, we have to leave it there. Director of the Center on U.S. Politics at University College London. We thank you so much for that conversation. Coming up on the program, we are going to get your stocks to watch, including Ryanair, after the budget airline cut its outlook for ticket prices this summer as consumers growing just a little bit more cautious. More on that next. This is Bloomberg. We're just shy of 15 minutes away from the opening trades across Europe. You are seeing futures higher across the board, though. Is this perhaps a little bit of autopilot? Is this a relief rally? We're not really sure what the reasoning is here, but it is higher by 0.7% on the Euro Stoxx 50. When you look across the board, though, you are seeing some weakness in the dollar. 108 on euro dollar, cable at 129. There's a lot going on here. But let's bring in a true expert who knows maybe and who can decipher what's happening in this early trade. I want to bring in Marcus Live executive editor Mark Cudmore to walk us through these markets. Mark, I'm looking at an FX trade here. After a very volatile 48 hours on the U.S. political landscape, a bit into haven assets like the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc, weakness in the Chinese yuan and the Mexican peso. Are these the early signs of the Trump trade in FX?
That would be the obvious interpretation, Kriti. I mean, certainly it seems like people are kind of going, hey, wait a sec, Biden's gone, Harris is on the ticket. Has it really changed things? Trump is still the favorite, and therefore, there's no real kind of game changer there. That said, none of the moves have been too dramatic yet, and I wouldn't want to jump to too many conclusions. I think one of my biggest takeaways of the last kind of 12 hours of just talking to an immense number of participants around the world is that the level of confusion is something almost unprecedented in terms of that people are really, really uncertain of or are politically biased in their answer towards whether Harris has a chance against Trump. But even when people have high conviction over which candidate might win or whether it's a serious race or not, they seem completely divided on what the impact will be of a Trump presidency or what a Harris presidency will be. I have rarely seen such divide in markets, and that's why I think you're seeing a little bit of whiplash, a little bit of volatility. I wouldn't read too much in terms of the long-term direction from the moves we've seen in the last kind of 12 hours or so.
Yeah, the distinct lack of certainty and clarity for these markets that they try to decode US politics. Mark, what is your take in terms of the bear steepener trade that money had tied to kind of the Trump trade? So yields higher at the back end, lower on the front end, and how the Fed plays into that. Where's your take on how that trade shapes up, do you think, in the days ahead?
Look, I believe in that. I am one of those people who've incorrectly called for a steepener to happen a couple of times before in the last year, and it hasn't come through yet. I am inclined to think it can work in the second half of this year, but not aggressively so. The reason I'm concerned is I worry that the Fed will not be able to cut as much as priced. I think that they, might turn out they only get one cut done this year. In the same way that we've seen the rollback in expectations in the ECB, I think that you might get later in this year that Fed kind of go, wait a sec, is inflation really under control? Sure, they may cut in September, but will they get a second? I think that'll be very, very difficult. So I think it'll be hard for at least a bull steepening. Now, you mentioned bear steepening. I do believe in that dynamic. I think the back-end yields can definitely rise a chunk as the new president comes in, whoever it is. But I think that's a dynamic for later on in the year rather than immediately.
Mark, just one more on the safe havens. Of course, you had gold at a record high last week. How long does its climb now last, especially as the Democrat ticket potentially looks stronger?
I think that the gold momentum in isolation, in terms of a lot of this year, we had gold rallying even as dollar strengthened, which is relatively unusual. And I think that kind of dynamic is going to change in terms of pure gold strength is probably near an end. However, I kind of think dollar softens in the second half of the year. So in dollar terms, gold may still have a little bit more to make, but it's going to stop being the massive outperformer on crosses. It's going to stop outperforming things like the euro and other currencies out there.
OK, 2,400 right now on the yellow metal. Bloomberg Markets Live executive editor Mark Cudmore on the divisions, the deep divisions within these markets when it comes to how to interpret US politics. Mark, thank you very much indeed, of course, for the analysis. You can get up-to-date analysis and insight from Mark and the rest of the team. Just go to MLive Go on your terminal. Now, numerous sectors, including aviation, are still trying to manage the fallout of a botched update of CrowdStrike software on Friday, and what will go down as the most spectacular IT failure the world has ever seen. Systems crashed, causing chaos in organisations around the world. Bloomberg's opening trade co-anchor Guy Johnson is at the Farnborough International Air Show in Hampshire. And Guy, we've got the US political news, of course, but we've also got the implications, the fallout of the tech chaos of Friday. Let's start with US politics then. What impact are you assessing will be had on this aviation sector from the US political changes? What is the sense you're getting from executives on the ground there?
I think the expectation, Tom, is that we are going to see a Trump presidency, and that certainly seems to be the kind of central case, I think, for a lot of people within the aerospace world. And what does that mean? I think there's two ways of looking at it. If you're on the civil side of this business, it probably means more tariffs. And if you think about the impact that those tariffs could have in terms of aircraft production, the supply chain, the impact through that supply chain really could be quite significant. So an ongoing realignment around those tariffs could take quite some time to work its way through. So people are talking about that as being one of the main stories that we could see as a result of a Trump presidency. And what we've seen over the last few hours doesn't really change that view, I think, for a lot of people. Then there's the second aspect of this, which is what is happening on the defense side of things. There is an expectation that a Trump presidency would push even harder the Europeans to spend more money on their own defence. There would be an expectation, certainly, that most countries in NATO would get up to the 2.5% level and potentially beyond that. Now, the key question that flows from that is where would that money be spent? And I think that's what a lot of people here will be grappling with. There is a strong desire within Europe to keep the bulk of that spending on this side of the Atlantic rather than it leaking out and going to the large defence contractors over in the United States, which has been traditional. So that's the challenge that Europe now faces. If we are going to spend more on defence, how do we ensure that that money gets spent on European defence rather than US defence? And I think that could be a factor as a result of what we're seeing with the Trump presidency as well, were it to come to pass.
We certainly look forward to that conversation. We know you have an all-star lineup throughout the next couple of hours of programming, but I want to bring it right back to Friday's outages as well, coming off that CrowdStrike update. We're still hearing about flight cancellations globally. What are you hearing on the ground?
So, Kriti, over 5,000 flights cancelled on Friday globally. It was really interesting kind of how different airlines got affected differently. You saw, for instance, JetBlue not being affected very much, some of the Gulf carriers not being affected very much, other carriers, American, United, being affected more significantly. IAG was affected to a certain extent. KLM was potentially affected a little bit more. So it's how it's working its way through the system is affecting different airlines. We are coming back online, but as we discussed, you and I discussed this on Friday on air, it takes a long time to get aircraft back in position, crews back in position, passengers in the right place, deal with the backlog. So it's going to take a few days potentially for some of this to come back. But I think there are going to be longer lasting lessons in terms of the impact that it's had. And it's going to be really interesting to see how airlines ultimately manage this risk going forward and how they think about maybe different ways of managing outages, global outages. And I think that's going to be the really interesting story here, is kind of how the aviation industry recalibrates itself to deal with these challenges going forward. So I think we're kind of through the worst of it. It's going to take a few days to clear, but it's going to take some time maybe to deal with the legacy effects of what we saw on Friday.
Do we see a Southwest Airlines 2.0? Bloomberg's opening trade co-anchor Guy Johnson over at the Farnborough International Air Show. He'll be back with an all-star lineup. In the meantime, it's not the only story showing up in the airline space. Lizzie Burden has our stocks to watch. Lizzie.
Indeed, I want to pick up on that airline theme, Kriti, because Ryanair is one of the key stocks to watch this morning. Of course, we had the earnings out this morning, the CFO, Neil Sorahan, speaking to Tom McKenzie earlier. And unfortunately, they have lowered their outlook. They say that fares will be materially lower in the second quarter than this time last year. They've cut their outlook for ticket prices in that crucial summer period. We've yet, though, to have the earnings from Wizz Air and Ryanair, and EasyJet, I should say. They're out later in the week. But if you look at the stock price over the year to date, it's already down by more than both of them so far, 14% so far this year. But look, the analyst ratings here, you've got 17 for buy, 15 for hold and none for sell. But let me take you to our next stock to watch this morning, Rent-A-Kill, best known as the maker of Rat Killer. And we had a report in the Sunday Times over the weekend that the former CEO of BT is looking to take it over. Philip Jansen, of course, he's talking to private equity firms about that. It would make him executive chairman of the firm. And it's interesting because Rent-A-Kill, of course, makes most of its money in the US, so it's seen as a potential takeover candidate. It could potentially move its listing over to the US because it's a cheaper value than its competitors. And, of course, you've also had Nelson Peltz taking a stake, which brings me on to our final stock to watch, Unilever, in which, of course, Peltz also has a stake. They're looking at kicking off IPO, initial discussions with buyout firms over a potential sale of its ice cream unit. Do the investors like it at the open? We shall see when it starts trading. Next up on the market open, we will bring you the open. This is Bloomberg.
A few minutes to go until the opening trade. We're seeing futures a little bit higher, but we're doing a little bit of detective work into why that is exactly, especially given the context of the last 24, 48 hours. This idea here that we're getting, of course, major U.S. political news. President Joe Biden choosing not to pursue a second term in office, throwing his weight behind Kamala Harris. So why is that a positive thing for the equity market, or at least is that as simple of a read-through? Well, it might actually have a lot more to do with the market plumbing and what we saw in the last two sessions. Take a look at this. In the European index and the S&P 500, you saw a sell-off both days. So is this simply buying a little bit of the dip in the last couple of sessions? That might explain some of the green on the screen, Lizzie.
Let me show you that green on the screen, Kriti. It's 0.6% higher for Eurostoxx 50 futures this morning. Same about for FTSE 100 futures. And stateside, we're looking to an even higher opening on Wall Street as well.
OK, we're checking in on some of the markets, or at least stocks to watch this Monday morning. In focus for us, Ryanair, Rent-A-Kill and Unilever. Let me stay on Ryanair then, because they have cut their outlook for prices. The summer season looking a little bit softer in terms of the yield story for Ryanair. Demand is still strong, the CFO told me, but they are having to trim their pricing. So good news for travellers, less so for the profit margins of Ryanair. We check in on that stock, called lower this morning. Rent-A-Kill, and some reporting that maybe the former CEO of BT is looking to take over this company in coordination with a private equity firm. So Rent-A-Kill in focus for us today. And Unilever, this has been a story that's been unfolding for a while, which is around its ice cream business, and reports suggesting that it is getting closer to spinning that part of the business off to PE as well. We are 4 seconds from the open with European futures pointing higher. Kriti.
Yeah, do we actually see that green on the screen continue? Remember, as we do actually see going back into Friday's session, it took a couple of minutes for the indexes to actually open up, still dealing with the IT outage story. Looks like the FTSE 100 is indeed open, kind of flat at the moment, though. We aren't seeing that much reaction. This is interesting, given that we saw such kind of vociferous, I think that's the word I'm going to use here, and you look at the futures trading. Anything that gets close to that 1% level really sets the stage for some pretty big gains. But you are seeing some outperformance just on those opening trades in Spain, of all places. So the IBEX actually higher by 0.5%. The Stock 600, Tom, higher by 0.3%. Even the FTSE MIB over in Italy, higher by 0.3%. But actually seeing outperformance again in the UK, in France. What is driving these moves, Tom.
Yeah, making up for some of the losses of last week. To what extent this is a bit of a catch-up trade. We focus in, of course, on the earnings story as well. Maybe that's where the lens is. The politics of the US, so much uncertainty. So how do you put money to play within that environment? As you were saying, the FTSE 100 posting gains right now in the first few seconds of 47 points, up 0.6% at 18,202. Over in France, a decent picture as well so far. Early days, of course, up 0.6%. In terms of individual stocks on the move, you've got Ocado Group leading the gains, currently up just shy of 5%. And then in terms of the airlines sector, you do have the likes of IAG, in terms of the airlines, one of the biggest losers, down 3%. We keep an eye, of course, on Ryanair on the back of the news there. And we do not have a pricing yet, but they have said, of course, they are downgrading their outlook for prices, given the softer picture when it comes to the prices willing to be paid by their customers and their flyers. Unilever also in focus on the news that maybe they're going to be spinning out that ice cream business, currently up 0.8%. And Rentokil, another stock in focus for us today. I'm not getting a price print yet, but there has been reporting that the former BT CEO might be looking to take over that company in partnership with a private equity firm. So we focus on that as well. When we get a pricing, of course, we'll bring that to you. Lizzie.
Yeah, every single sector of the Stock 600 in the green, in positive territory this morning. But it is interesting, as you say, those individual stocks that we have been watching this morning. You've got National Grid, one of the key outperformers on the Stock 600 this morning. And they're behind it, AstraZeneca as well, Siemens up as well. Yeah, consumer products and services, really one of the outperformers in terms of sectors as we look at the opening trade this morning.
I want to also point out very quickly, we're seeing heavy volume in Zurich Insurance as well, down almost about 1%. It's not going to be one of your major weight contributors to the Stock 600, but it is certainly one that we keep our eye on as well. And I want to point out we had some outperformance in the IBEX and the French index as well. A lot of those look to be bank-led, so we're going to be really keeping an eye on what that read-through actually is, or is it simply a rates play? Of course, we're going to do a little bit more investigative reporting there. But in the meantime, return back to our major story, our top story on both sides of the Atlantic. President Joe Biden stepping down in terms of pursuing a second term in office, focusing for the remainder of his term simply on what's going on in the states, throwing his weight behind the likes of Kamala Harris. Let's get the latest with Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn joining us out of Washington, D.C. Vonnie, I think the big conversation here, at least at the European market open, is what changes on the policy front if indeed Kamala Harris enters the White House.
Well, as Isaac Botalski of Compass Point says, really not much, because Harris and Biden are basically in lockstep when it comes to policy. But also we need to learn what Harris's positions on certain things will be. And presumably we'll do that over the next 4 weeks plus. It's 106 days till the actual election itself, so there is time. And now there is money as well, Kriti, which is extremely important. We had the biggest one day of fundraising this campaign yet Sunday. And that'll tell you something, because there was more than $20 million raised 2 days in a row after the debate. We had almost $70 million raised from small dollar donors on Sunday. So this town, you know, it gets over shocks pretty quickly. 12 hours ago, it was still in shock that President Biden had finally decided he was actually going to pull out of the race. He had only told his own staff a few moments before he posted a statement on Twitter saying that, and then posted a follow-up endorsing Kamala Harris. And then all eyes went to, well, who else is going to endorse Kamala Harris? We had tweets from former President Obama, for example, praising Joe Biden, but not necessarily endorsing Harris. But then we did start to get a trickle and a flood from influential Democrats of endorsements for Harris. It does now look like she is very much the front runner. She's due to speak in Washington, D.C. at 11:30 a.m. local time Monday morning. And that follows some appearances on morning shows by some potential candidates for VP. She does have to pick her VP. She can take up to 4 weeks plus to do that before the DNC. But, for example, Governor Josh Shapiro, blue state wall, Pennsylvania, turned red last election. He could very potentially deliver Pennsylvania for Harris if he were to be on the ticket. That might be one path to the White House for the Democrats. He's a potential. Tomorrow we're going to hear from Andy Bashir Speaker of Kentucky, Roy Cooper, also of North Carolina. And also Joe Manchin is going to be appearing on the morning shows. And we know as well that he is mulling re-registering as a Democrat and potentially challenging Harris. Now, this is important, not because Joe Manchin is thinking of doing this. That's almost a side point at this point. It's important, though, because nobody else has actually talked about challenging Harris. She does seem to have full reign to move on, move ahead, bring the Democratic Party with her and unify the Democratic Party with her. And to that end, the Convention Rules Committee said late on Sunday evening that it's going to stream its live meeting on Wednesday, where it's going to put together a process, a framework for actually dealing with selecting a new nominee. Don't forget, this is pretty uncharted waters.
Yeah.
And in quoting now, it's going to be open, transparent, fair and orderly, trying to preempt any strike from the Republicans on that score.
OK, Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn in Washington with the latest. Thank you very much indeed for the update. Let's get the market perspective now and bring in Wolf von Rotberg, equity strategist at J. Safra Saracen. Wolf, thanks for your time. How should the markets be adjusting then to the politics? We have someone quoted one of the BN pieces today saying, I wish we were having a little less history. History is being made in the United States. How do markets adjust to that history?
Well, we need to see what will happen in markets with regards to what happened over the weekend. I don't think that at the end of the day it will be the driving force over the coming months. We may see a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, unwinding some of the moves which we've had last week. But eventually, what really matters is the cycle, is the macro data which we're currently having, and this may even change, may still change quite a bit until the election in November. And I think that's more important. And with regards to that, I think we are, kind of seeing a slowing cycle that will define the rate space, and there will be a, read across for equity markets coming from rates, which will have a much more material impact on the market than just politics.
Interesting. It's interesting you take the view that it really clearly is about the macro and not the politics. So on the macro front then, where is your lens right now? There are some within our M Live strategy team suggesting that the Fed could go with a jumbo cut in September. In terms of the central bank reaction function to that slightly softer data that you referenced, how do you see that playing out?
We need to see what they're saying in July. I think that's the Fed, obviously, they have lined out their strategy, saying they want to see 3 consecutive PCE prints, which are clearly pointing towards inflation coming down to around 2%. We obviously get a PCE number on Friday. The last 2 months, we've had a month-over-month change of 0.1% in the core. That's definitely been a very positive number with regards to the Fed's target. If we, kind of see a, let's say, a slightly softer surprise, or a surprise on the soft side as compared to what the consensus is currently expecting, which would be 0.2% or 20 basis points on the core PCE, then I think the Fed can, would probably, let's say, put a bit more dovish message out in their July meeting, which would, kind of follow what the market has been pricing lately, saying September cut becoming more of a consensus here.
Wolf, you're an equity strategist, but I want to bring in the currency conversation, the currency component into this, because if we're talking about the Federal Reserve and the positioning around the U.S. election and the geopolitics around the world, it feels like the dollar story is quite relevant to whether or not international investors really want to hop in to the likes of the S&P 500 at this time. Your take on the dollar's role right now?
Obviously, we've seen the dollar grinding higher over the past, let's say, 2 or 3 years. It's been very much a function of the U.S. cycle. So the U.S. leading the world on the base or on the back, let's say, of a much stronger fiscal expansion than what we've had elsewhere, excess savings, driving the consumer and so forth. So the domestic demand in the U.S. was just extraordinary. And this has helped the dollar to appreciate against pretty much any other currency out there. We've basically seen the peak in this cycle. We are at the back end of this mountain. We are kind of grinding lower. It's not a big a drop here, but as the cycle in the US is slowing, and I think the consumer plays a role here. The excess savings have probably been depleted by now. The fiscal side is still expansionary, but not really providing much of a stimulus because it's not expanding from where it was last year. the dollar should probably weaken somewhat as the cycle is slowing in the US.
So does that mean you buy Europe then as well? I mean, there's a narrative out there that the European index is a catch-up trade for the States, given that the majority of companies have the majority of their exposure to that consumer story in the States. So if you're talking about these dynamics in the States, how does Europe benefit?
I mean, for the European market, it's a bit of a complicated story, I would say. On the one hand, obviously, valuations are looking very attractive. Yeah, we go sector by sector. Pretty much every sector is cheaper than in the US. Problematic for Europe, though, is that it's very much tied, or to a large extent tied, to what's happening in Asia. It's to a large extent also a function of the Asian consumer, in particular the Chinese consumer. That's where we really not seeing any, dynamics, no support whatsoever. We have seen some companies reporting over the past week or so, in particular on the apparel, on the durables side in Europe, which have given us a pretty downbeat picture on the Chinese consumer. So I wouldn't just jump into the European market from that point of view. But what we have in Europe still is more defensive sectors, which are pretty, attractively valued. We look at Swiss equities, for example, not saying that these Swiss equities should, see a big surge in earnings or benefit from the growth picture, but they are just very attractively valued in an environment in which rates come down. So I would be selective on Europe, saying, look, there are some defensive sectors, some defensive elements which are looking very attractive at this point in the cycle. Stay a bit away from the cyclical side. But then, and that's, I think, the last comment on this, what we're seeing right now is a bit of an unwind of the pressures which we've had over the past 2 years, particularly in the small cap space, highly levered and so forth. This can hold for a bit longer in our view.
Well, Wolf, very quickly, I'm going to get a little nerdy here. What metrics are you using to assess that the valuations in Europe are cheap, given that so much of the rally has been largely concentrated in some of those mega cap names of the Sensational Six? We'll get a quick check on, but the likes of ASML, Novo Nordisk, et cetera. What does the valuation metric? What is it that you're using primarily?
No, primarily the PE, the 12-month forward PE in Europe. I mean, it's at around 15 times or so, maybe a tad higher. But in the US, even if we exclude the Magnificent Seven, we are at around 20 times. So there's a big gap between the two regions. And I think that's something, which is justified by the fact that the US is definitely, having a higher productivity potential going forward, probably stronger structural earnings growth, but not to the extent which we are seeing right now. So I would think that there will be some sort of convergence in valuations going forward. Not saying that Europe should see a massive re-rating, but mostly that the US will probably see a de-rating as the cycle is slowing. And then the other valuation metric, which I think is very interesting, is the dividend yield. And that's more if we go into the, let's say, the fringes of the European market. Once again, the Swiss market looking very attractive on dividend yield. Some parts of the UK market looking very attractive on dividend yield, although I would stay away from the sectors in the UK which are looking the most attractive, be it energy and miners and those guys, because I think that's probably a bit of a head fake or, let's say, a valuation trap if you just go on the basis of dividend yield into these kind of more cyclical parts of the UK market.
Well, Wolf, is there a valuation hit then if we do get these tariffs? If Trump wins in November, and I'm going to bring it back to the politics of the US, does the valuation story get challenged in Europe?
Definitely. If Trump were to go with, let's say, the 10% across all imports into the US, then there's definitely a risk for European exporters, which would probably take another hit. But again, I think what's more important by the time we get there, and it may not be November, it may only be January, the inauguration. Maybe everyone will be waiting basically until Trump is actually in office. Like last time, we saw the tax reform only happening 2017, 2018. That's when the market started to rally. So when it actually had the politics or the policies on the table, the market may wait until 2025 this time again if Trump were to come into office. But if there's a 10% across-the-board tariff on imports into the US, European exporters are definitely exposed.
OK, Wolf von Rotberg, equity strategist at J. Safra Saracen, on the lens, of course, through the central banks, but also the politics of the US. We appreciate it in terms of the analysis across these markets on such a consequential but challenging day for investors, given the lack of clarity. Let's zoom in right now on the sensational six, the core six European equity companies that we check in on every day, of course, throughout the trading week to get a gauge as to their sentiment. You've got the likes of Novo Nordisk. This was a company, of course, that Kriti was referencing there in terms of the valuation story. That is front and centre, of course, the maker of those weight loss drugs. Just getting 0.6%. To what extent is that company vulnerable to any political pressure in the US around pricing? We know that is part of the debate. LVMH, of course, with the luxury tilt, currently gaining 1.2%. Also potentially in the crosshairs, of course, as around any further fallout between US-China and European-China tensions. Ferrari gaining today, just shy of 0.2%, and some upside coming through for ASML on the tech side. Of course, that was a company that fell a bit of a squeeze last week with that sell-off in semis and the linkages to that part of the business. Schneider Electric with the AI story at play there, getting 0.2%, and Nestle in terms of the consumer staples up 0.7. Let's check in on how some of the other individual stocks are on the move today, and it's an earnings story and Ryanair. Wow, what a story there, Lizzie.
Yeah, Ryanair, of course, standing out there, down 11.8% off the back of those earnings. But it's also an impact of that global IT outage, which, of course, impacted all of these airlines on the screen at the moment. They all experienced stops on their flights on Friday, and that impact continuing into this week. If we flip over, you can also see the impact on insurance stocks. They, too, impacted by the global outage. But actually, Beazley managed to eke out some gains this morning, higher 0.3%. Not so much for Hiscox, it has to be said. If we flip over, we were talking about the rat killer maker Rentokil earlier, and those shares up 11.8% this morning. As I say, this is on that Sunday Times report that the former BT CEO, Philip Jansen, is looking at potentially a takeover in conjunction with private equity firms. And the reason for so much excitement, perhaps, is because Rentokil makes most of its money in the US, so potentially this could move its listing stateside because it trades at a cheaper value than many of its competitors. Flipping over, I've also thrown in Unilever, one of the big movers this morning, higher 0.5% after on Friday, late Friday, we got that news that actually it's kicking off its initial discussions with buyout firms about a buyout of its ice cream business. The summer theme continuing here. But look, this has been something that's been going on for a while. It includes the likes of Ben & Jerry's and Magnum, and investors seeming to like the idea of this. Just finally, Ocado, another of the big gainers this morning. You've had it announcing that the US grocer Kroger, which is, of course, one of its most important customers for its warehouse offering, is going to roll out a new range of automated tech. So Ocado shares liking at this morning, higher 6.4%. Kriti.
All right, Lizzie Burden walking us through some of the major stocks to watch. Coming up on the program, we're going to dive into where Lizzie started. Ryanair's first quarter shares falling as the budget airlines cuts its outlook for ticket prices in the crucial summer travel period. Tom spoke to Ryanair's CFO. We're going to bring you some more of that conversation next. This is Bloomberg.
Consumers obviously the big winner this summer, Tom. We've seen 15% lower fares into Q1. Where we're talking about fares trending materially down at the moment. It all very much depends on what the close in August and September fares look like. But our strategy has always been to fill the planes and we price accordingly. We're load active, yield passive. We've got the lowest costs of any airline in Europe and we can afford to do so. Bookings are very strong. We're taking in about 500,000 bookings a night. We're carrying around about 600,000 people a day. It's just that I think the consumers are a little bit more frugal, a little bit more cautious about how they're spending their money, and they want to get away. Ryanair has the lowest cost, so we can afford to have the lowest fares. And we're happy to hit the traffic targets and if we have to price accordingly, we will do.
So demand is higher, but consumers are certainly a little pickier when it comes to pricing.
I think so.
How concerned are you about the consumer right now? How much softness do you see, and how long and to what extent does that prevail?
We're not hugely concerned, because, I mean, the key advantage we have is the cost base. In Ryanair, we've got 450 million worth of fuel savings already locked in for the current financial year, which means our costs are only rising modestly this year at a time when most of our competitors' costs are rising quite significantly. So we're in a very strong position. We'll deliver nearly 200 million passengers in the current financial year, and if we have to fly at slightly lower fares, very happy to do so.
And those slightly lower fares, they continue throughout this year. Do they turn around next year? When do you see that turnaround in terms of fares?
If you think logically, capacity is usually constrained in Europe. Yeah. We've got all of the OEMs in London this week for Farnborough. Capacity is going to remain constrained for some time to come. We're already seeing the Pratt & Whitney engine issue on the A320 operators, likely to run on for another 2 years. Boeing and Airbus alike are behind on their deliveries.
So that puts something of a floor under pricing, the capacity issue?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, capacity is not going to get back to... We're not even at pre-COVID levels yet. We're probably peak summer, 97-98% of pre-COVID capacity. The OEMs are going to take at least 4 or 5 years to catch up on their backlogs, possibly into the 2030s. M&A is taking off in Europe. We've got the ITA Lufthansa deal. Air Europa, IAG will probably get the green light later on this summer, and then TAP is going up for sale. So I think capacity will be constrained for some time. Fares will be underpinned by that. And if you look at the fares that we had in the first quarter, and indeed the fares that we may have in the second quarter, they're still well ahead of where they were pre-COVID. We've had 2 years of double-digit fares, double-digit growth. And if we have to see a little bit of a pullback this year and hit the 200 million traffic target, we're still going to be very profitable.
Well, that was Ryanair CFO Neil Sorahan speaking to me earlier this morning. Ryanair being ravaged right now in the session, down close to 12%. Morgan Stanley saying the results, Q1 results, were meaningfully below consensus. We heard the CFO there talking about the cost structure for Ryanair being supportive. Morgan Stanley says while cost performance was slightly better than expectations, it is irrelevant in the context of these results. That's a take from Morgan Stanley. But this is, of course, a company that is operating in an environment that is challenged by, of course, the supply of aircraft. And to some extent, Neil Sorahan saying those constraints will prove supportive for pricing going forward. But right now, prices are being squeezed. Good news for flyers, bad news for the profits of Ryanair.
Yeah, that's kind of on the supply side. But then, more broadly across airline, you haven't had corporate travel rebounding properly out of the pandemic. You've had the cost of living crisis, as Sorahan was kind of talking about, hitting people not willing to stump up their cash to pay up for these steeper fares. But it is interesting, this debate about whether the issue is overcapacity or whether it's consumer weakness, and Sorahan falling into the latter camp.
There's consumer weakness, there's overcapacity, then you have to factor in the likes of wage issues. You're still seeing them, especially in Germany, really show up. You are seeing supply chain constraints, as I believe Guy was talking about earlier in the program. The geopolitical narrative, of course, and even the Olympics is having a negative effect on some of these carriers, like the of Air France KLM, the likes of United and Delta, saying that they're actually taking hits on their profit because people don't want to go to Paris for the Olympics.
Except you.
Except for me, which I was going to kind of try to sneak into the conversation. That's happening in about 11 days, just saying. But I think it's a really interesting environment when we're talking about a fairly resilient consumer. I think that's part of the conversation you had as well.
Yeah, I mean, what Ryanair was saying, essentially, what Neil was saying, was that we still have that demand. We're still booking up all these planes, but we're having to lower prices. That consumers seeing a little vulnerable, and that's really interesting, just more broadly as a gauge as to the health of the European and global consumer. But who better to do a deep dive on, of course, the airline sector than Guy Johnson? And we're going to be crossing out to Guy Johnson, of course, anchor on the opening trade, live at the Farnborough International Air Show. He's going to be speaking with the CEO of German aerospace company Lilium, and we'll get Guy's take as well on all these challenges facing this airline industry. That is next. This is Bloomberg.
We are 30 minutes into the European trading session. We are seeing green on the screen across a lot of these markets on an equity level. But then you are seeing some interesting FX moves as well. A lot of this is going to be perhaps factoring or early signs of factoring in the news that President Joe Biden throwing his weight behind Kamala Harris to be the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party. And again, big emphasis on presumptive. That has not been cleared yet, but it is something that's still being kind of early priced in to the Trump trade. We're seeing that in the FX space, strength into some of the havens like the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc as well, weakness in the likes of the yuan and the Mexican peso. You're also seeing gold at a record high, or at least hit at a little bit of a retracement there, but certainly one that we're keeping an eye on. That is your macro picture. On the equities front, airlines very much in focus. Ryanair, of course, coming out and saying, look, the demand story is not the concern, but the pricing very much is. They're also dealing with the fallout of the likes of the IT outage, flight cancellations still rolling on globally 3 days after that CrowdStrike update. All of that in conversation at the Farnborough International Air Show, which is, of course, in full swing as aircraft industry high flyers gather with supply and demand expected to, of course, be a key topic of discussion up in addition to everything I just laid out. We can go back there. Bloomberg's Guy Johnson on location with a special guest. Guy.
Yep. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, we're joined by Klaus Rowe. He is the CEO of Lilium. What is Lilium? Lilium is an eVTOL company. Electric vertical takeoff and landing. This is a new generation of aircraft that is coming in, and we're wondering kind of how the story is going to progress. So let's try and find out. The story, obviously, over the last 24 hours, Klaus, has been what we've seen in the United States and the politics and how that has developed. Joe Biden is stepping down. A lot of people here, a lot of people in aviation firmly believe that Donald Trump is going to be the next president of the United States. How would a Trump presidency, do you think, affect how your business, your industry is ultimately going to progress?
Yeah, it's very hard to say. We know from his first term he had a certain idea about economies. I don't think it's necessarily going to affect us a lot because, first of all, we are sourcing a lot from the US, so Lilium Jet has a good proportion of US goods inside. Also, we plan to go to the United States. The United States, we believe, stands for about a good third of the market. So we will have to manufacture this aircraft in the United States.
When are we doing that?
That would be, we will set up for decisions kind of somewhere end of next year, and we would need the final assembly line in 29. We would also make battery production in the United States because it's all dangerous goods and you need to get it close to the customers. Our aircraft cannot fly over the Atlantic, so we have to build it on the other side of the Atlantic. And from my past experience at Airbus, when Trump raised import duties and we had a final assembly line in Alabama, that was quite helpful. And I think in this regard, it shouldn't make a big difference whatever stance he takes.
Okay, but you think you're going to have to manufacture in the States? You know where in the States? I'm assuming there's a lot of senators here. I'm going to be talking to a bunch later. Do you have any visibility yet?
I think I have 3 meetings today.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. We would want to do it as close as possible to the key markets. The key markets will be on the East Coast, will be Florida, would be New York, would also be California. Texas would be a big market. So we would want to have some opportunities and see who makes what kind of proposals. But it should be close to the customer. So where the majority of end customers is, you would want to assemble the aircraft, but also maintain the aircraft.
So it's not just tariffs that would take you there. It's not. It's ultimately the customer that takes you there.
It's a customer. It's proximity to the customer. It's also talent. It's logistics. So I think we have about 50 factors playing into the equation where you would finally want to go. For sure, tariffs is one essential part of it. But talent, I would say, is also one. Customer, maybe. If I have to name the top 3, that won't be the ones.
Okay. So you're also looking at a line potentially here in Europe as well. I've seen Bordeaux being mentioned in France as being a possibility. Does the politics in Paris kind of affect, do you think, the outcome of where you're ultimately going to build that? Could it be somewhere else other than Bordeaux?
It could be. So we are going for a competition. So Bordeaux is one place, but there's others around. What the politicians are going to do, I think they are very busy with themselves because in France they have no history where they ever had to find a coalition. So we are watching what is going to go on, what the final constellation will be, and then we can make our judgment if this will affect us or not. As we speak, we talk exactly to the same people. So we largely talk to BPI, so the French investment bank. For sure, there is political decision makers behind, and they may change, but we have no clue in which direction.
Do you think political volatility? You've worked for Airbus for like nearly 3 decades. You've come into Lilium now. Do you get a sense that political volatility is going to be a bigger problem going forward for manufacturers such as yourselves?
Absolutely. So what you need, any industrial company or non-industrial company, you would want to have certainty. You would want to be able to plan. And when you see huge changes in politics and people potentially taking completely different directions than before, you are losing the ability to plan. And I think in the end, it's a disadvantage for any country. If industry cannot rely long-term anymore on key decisions, people may turn their back on the country and say, I have to go somewhere else where I have more stability.
You went public via SPAC in 21. The share price has been fairly volatile since then. You joined the company. Now you're going to bring some industrial rigor. You've just signed a deal with Saudia, big Gulf carrier, brings quite a lot of credibility, obviously, into the business as well.
Yeah.
Just talk me through kind of what the next big milestones are for you, how much money you've got, how much you've just done a capital raise as well, how much more money are you going to need? How important is it to get this aircraft flying and actually to be able to demonstrate to people that is going to be a realistic probability in the near term?
So the aircraft is flying since a couple of years. We have 2 demonstrator aircraft. This is almost forgotten, but they are almost the same size. They are the same physics like the Lilium jet is, but the Lilium jet is going to take off early next year. I think people will be blown away by the aesthetics, but also by the performance of the aircraft. And this is what the market wants to see. On the other side, they also want to see that we have commercial success. And you just named Saudia. Saudia is a state-owned carrier. Saudia is, I would say, a carrier with very high ambitions. And being selected by them, this is a very noisy plane.
I was about to say, these like...
if this was a Lilium jet, we would not be interrupted at all. No, basically you wouldn't hear it. At the distance it was just flying by. You would not hear it. No, I think commercial success, demonstrating the technical abilities of the aircraft, and our aircraft is the biggest, the fastest, lowest operating cost, and this is what people are going to see very soon once we are going to fly. Yes, and it will also help us in the financial market. While we are now looking, as you mentioned, we look into the US, we look into France. We have very intense talks with the German government also, which is going to help us raising some funds, which will not be dilutive, which is also good news, I think. And we are exploring a couple of other opportunities.
You have enough money for now. You are presumably going to have to go through multiple rounds, though. How does the process work? How did, in terms of, you went public via a SPAC.
Yeah.
You've gone through that process. You've now raised additional money. What are the next fundraising milestones you're looking at?
So we are still active in the marketplace. We still talk to investors. We talk as well to our incumbent investors, and we have some big names behind us. We are talking with the German and the French government. We should have decisions rather sooner than later. But we are also looking into debt-based solutions. So there's quite a big instrument to play. We have until now only played equity market. We have raised 1.5 billion from the equity market so far. I think in the future it may be less equity. It may be also public funding from the state support. And it may be non-dilutive funding. And also we are taking in pre-delivery payments. So with the Saudi deal is one piece of evidence that it really works. And we are going to get down payments from customers, which we can also use to carry on developing the aircraft and industrializing the aircraft.
I spoke a moment about you bringing rigor. You were at Airbus for a long time. You understand the industrial process. You understand the regulatory process that aircraft have to go through to get from A to B to C to actually be delivered to customers. Where is Lilium now in that process? How much rigor is there?
Yeah. So Airbus, for sure, is a very professional company, and we can see it here behind us. Lilium, a startup, and the startup, for sure, is much more agile. It's faster, shorter decision-making. Everybody knows everybody. And this is good, because otherwise, such a groundbreaking innovation you would not bring to life. Airbus would, I think, have more difficulties bringing it to life. On the other side, when you want to certify, when you want to industrialize, you also need to bring a lot of the professionalism of a company like Airbus into a startup company. A startup alone would never certify such an aircraft with a startup mentality. You would never build up an industrial system. You would never engage with the suppliers that we have engaged with. So my target is always, I'm always saying we need to be a professional startup. And I think we are now, maybe we are 90% there. Could be a little bit more professional still, but we want to keep the agility and the innovation power, because We are going to make more planes than the Lilium jet in the future. We want to update technologies, latest battery technology. So we need to keep the momentum of the startup whilst when we want to deliver this aircraft in hundreds and thousands potentially in the future, we also need to have the rigor of Airbus.
Great to see you. Thanks for stopping by to see
Thanks.
us. Thanks very much. Klaus Roth, the CEO of Lilium, from the Farnborough Air Show, where we've got some great political interviews lined up a little bit later on. We're going to be talking to key US senators. Glenn Youngkin's going to be joining us from Virginia as well. We're going to take on what US politics is going to mean to this air show throughout the day. For now, though, back to you.
Thanks, Guy Johnson. At the Farnborough International Air Show, it's not just the political guests, loads of conversations coming up with aviation leaders as well. We're going to be speaking to the CIO of IAG, the Turkish Airlines chairman, and the CEO of Qatar Airways. So a busy day for Guy Johnson. But coming up on the programme, as Biden bows out, Kamala Harris wins endorsements and donations. But will she tie up the Democratic nomination? We'll discuss that next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back now. World leaders have paid tribute to Joe Biden after the US president announced that he will not be standing for re-election in November. President Biden is the first sitting president since 1968 to drop out of a presidential race. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Berlin for a gauge then on the international reaction to this momentous news. It is a slice of history out of the US. Ollie, what have we been hearing then from European leaders reacting to President Biden's decision?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of reaction of reverence and respect for Joe Biden for actually stepping out of the race, and something that we sort of came to see in Europe as a sort of reliable friend, whether it's Olaf Scholz, whether it's Emmanuel Macron, in the form of Joe Biden. I'll give you Olaf Scholz, given that we are in Berlin, in his remarks, saying that thanks to Joe Biden, the transatlantic cooperation is close, NATO is strong, and the U.S. is a good and reliable partner for us. His decision not to run again deserves respect. Now, in the things that he enumerated there about close transatlantic cooperation, a strong NATO, and a reliable partner for Europe and for Germany, that stands in rather stark contrast to what came just before Joe Biden in the form of Donald Trump, who was, particularly towards Germany, very, very critical about a great number of things, some of which he was actually right about that did actually bear out, whether it was paying 2% towards NATO, concerns around Russian gas. But it was really the way in which Donald Trump went about it, where he put a lot of these feuds out publicly, and there was a lot of sparring. And that is something that, Scholz and the German government were very happy to get a reprieve from. But we also look at the other countries this morning who are really dependent on the United States, namely Ukraine. Zelensky really saying that it was thanks to him and the support that he granted during the most sort of dramatic moment of their history. We also heard from Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, who is, again, appreciating Biden for all of his support throughout the war with Gaza and Hamas. Where things begin to get interesting is, I think, for many of these leaders, they look at sort of who is going to come next, and they look at Kamala Harris. And I don't think that they think that much about President Harris. I think they probably think more about candidate Harris and her ability to take on Donald Trump, which is really going to be the main focus, because from a policy standpoint, I don't think there's going to be a huge divergence between the sort of Harris foreign policy and the Biden policy.
Yeah, that's interesting. It would be good if you could expand on what her foreign policy actually would look like. And just, in terms of these European leaders, I do think it's important to point out it's different tipping your hat to Joe Biden on his way out and actually giving him influence in these final months as president.
Yeah, Lizzie, and I think that is going to be very interestingly tested, right, tomorrow, when Benjamin Netanyahu, again, one of the sort of key figures for the United States in the international stage, where he's going to go meet with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, right? And so in terms of where the sort of policy proposals are and where they sort of stand, as we know, Kamala Harris has been much more of a sort of domestically focused politician coming from California as a prosecutor. Much of her international experience, so-called, was with the southern border and dealing with the migration crisis, which really hasn't been a a huge winning topic for the Democrats and for Kamala Harris. But she has stood in for Joe Biden at the Munich Security Conference. She was in Europe just days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. She's been very outspoken on the issue of NATO and Ukraine and Russia, very consistent there. Similar on Iran and China in terms of consistency. Where you do see a little bit of divergence, and this is interesting, again, given that Netanyahu is in D.C. and will meet with both of them, is she was one of the first high-profile politicians in the United States to come out and call for a ceasefire and really been sort of very critical of some of the ways in which Israel has prosecuted its war, though, of course, always supporting throughout the right to defend themselves. It also, the question of foreign policy may be a weak point in taking on Donald Trump, who, of course, has already served as president and dealt with a lot of these leaders one-on-one.
Really fascinating context. Bloomberg's Oliver Kirk joining us from Berlin, giving us the take not only from the Middle East, but from Europe as well. We appreciate that so much. I want to dive into more of that and really expand on that analysis and bring in Tina Fordham, founder of geopolitical advisory firm Fordham Global Insight. Tina, of course, I'm sure you've been following, like the rest of us, this tick by tick. Before we dive into some of the policy implications, I just want to take a moment to really emphasize just President Joe Biden has been a career politician for 40 years and counting, spending so much of his time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And before we dive into kind of the international implications further, I want to get your take on whether this signifies a more drastic turn away from a candidate who is a career politician. We've seen this in other parts of the world. The UK, for example, being a career politician isn't always a good thing. President Trump certainly isn't one either. Tina, is this the start of the end of career politicians?
No, it's not the start of the end of career politicians, and Kamala Harris has been in government for a long time, and of course she's been the vice president sitting in the White House. So that wouldn't be how I characterize this, and I want to suggest that we resist the tendency to overthink what's just happened in this race. Basically, American voters have been offered an alternative to Trump, and Harris's task is really about mobilizing those never-Trumpers and various other sort of constituencies to form a new coalition. So I would not suggest that we apply the same lens to this race when the playbook has just been torn up.
Can she do that, though? Can she not only unify the party, but unify the country, especially when Ollie, for example, was diving into some of the details around foreign policy? One of her criticisms is that she doesn't really have a very strong foreign policy record. What would you say to that? How does she fight that allegation?
Well, first of all, I mean, the people that I advise most closely are international investors and the global C-suite who are looking for the chances that Trump doesn't win, right? Especially when it comes to European security, Asian security, the U.S. security umbrella. So the assumption should be that a President Harris would maintain that broad continuity and commitment to U.S. participation in global institutions. The detail of her foreign policy is not going to be what makes or breaks her chances in winning this election.
And good morning, Tina. Lizzie here. Our last guest, Thomas Gift from UCL, made the point that Joe Biden now is a lame duck. That's pretty obvious. But I wonder whether it's responsible for him to stay as current president if, by his own judgment, he isn't up to being the next president.
I mean, this is punditry, right? Biden is going to go down in history as a one-term president. That's not a short list that any U.S. president wants to be on. He'll want to finish out his now the presidential race. There's an opportunity, a short one at that, to change the guard in the Democratic Party.
And so what can he hope to achieve in these last few months in the White House?
Well, given the new decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court, if he wanted to, he could ram through all kinds of things. It remains to be seen whether he'll take the opportunity to do that. But remember that the executive branch of the U.S. government has just been massively strengthened by the U.S. Supreme Court. I really think the focus will be between now and January, because remember that Biden will stay on through January, in maintaining party unity and in really showcasing what Harris can do. But most of all, Harris should be judged on her ability to unify this coalition. That's why the vice presidential nominee will matter more, in my view, than it usually does. And what I would say to your viewers is, instead of thinking, can a Black woman actually be elected as the U.S. president, in contrast to, well, the U.S. has never voted for a female president, let alone a Black one, but whether the country wants to have a second term of Donald Trump or not. And that's where perhaps there are some commonalities with what we've just seen in the UK. Keir Starmer didn't set the world on fire with his charisma, but the opposition to the incumbent Conservative Party ruling for 14 years was enough to put the Labour Party in office.
Tina, you mentioned the companies, the executives that you advise. What are you hearing from them in terms of how they adjust and how the polling is informing your view as to how it stacks up in November, with all the caveats, of course, that apply?
Well, this is the fifth U.S. presidential race that I've covered professionally as a political analyst, looking at the impact on financial markets. And it's still very early. We've had 2 July surprises when it's really an October surprise that matters most. So what I'm advising is just simply the historical fact that political polling for presidential races doesn't really have much predictive value until much closer to the time, September, October. Remember that Hillary Clinton was 4 points ahead and predicted to be the winner, and it was a couple of developments, the Comey report, her alleged fainting spell at a 9/11 memorial, that changed that trajectory. So markets have been getting ahead of themselves, seeing Trump as a sure thing, and I've been cautioning for a long time that there are just too many wild.
OK, Tina, unfortunately, we're having some issues with the connection. Sometimes happens in live TV, but we really appreciate your analysis and your insights as we try to get a better steer as to what the implications are, of course, of the decision by President Biden to step away as candidate of this Democratic Party and hand the reins to, of course, Kamala Harris. That is the aspiration from Joe Biden. We'll see, of course, if that gets reinforced by the Democratic National Committee and Convention as well. Tina Fordham, founder of Fordham Global Insight on US politics. We appreciate it. Here's what else we're going to be looking out for then this week. Of course, the focus today, above and beyond the politics. We've got Guy Johnson on the ground. He's going to be weaving this into his discussions as well at the Farnborough International Air Show that is happening, of course, today and through tomorrow as well. He's going to be speaking to a number of US senators about the politics and how that transmits into that crucial airline sector. We've got the Alphabet earnings story as well. Reminder that this is still earnings season. And so for those who want to focus on the fundamentals, Alphabet reports later this week. Euro area consumer confidence in terms of the softness or not of the European consumer in a growth environment that's looking maybe a little bit more challenged, and how that ties into the thinking of the ECB. LVMH reporting as well, key gauge in terms of the luxury demand without exposure to China. European banks reporting, Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, Banco Santander and UniCredit. That takes us back to the ECB conversation, of course, in terms of how banks prepare for lower interest rates. And Benjamin Netanyahu addressing Congress on Wednesday. Pretty fascinating timing, of course, given what some would characterise as this lame duck president now, and the implications for the geopolitics of the Middle Eastern region. And you've got another luxury earnings on Thursday with Kering. Hermes over in France, of course, reporting as well. And then G20 finance ministers meeting in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And then on Friday, the Paris Olympics begin. We're also beginning data out of the US as well. Paris Olympics, I believe, maybe Kriti Gupta might be going along.
It's all in the name of journalism, investigative journalism.
Of course it is.
I have to see it. Also, I feel like Americans are the only ones excited about this. We're gonna have this conversation later. We gotta end it for the opening trade. The Pulse is up next. This is Bloomberg.